More than half of us live in the planet's urban areas, and many of them are pollution black spots. So, how can cities become part of the answer to climate change? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello there, I'm Shiulie Ghosh. Heavy traffic, urban development, millions of people using up resources. It's easy to see why the world's cities are centres of carbon consumption. But now there's a push to reinvent cities so they can play a role in solving the problem of global warming instead of causing it.
Climate change is a global phenomenon that could have a huge effect on urban life. The increase in temperature, rising sea levels, floods, droughts and storms could all have a devastating impact on cities. According to the pressure group C40 Cities, 70% of cities are already dealing with the effects of climate change, and nearly all are at risk. More than half the world's population, 55%, lives in urban areas. Not only are cities at risk, but they also contribute to climate change, responsible for about 75% of global CO2 emissions. So there's pressure for cities to start providing solutions. One expert from the University of Houston has said cities need to mitigate their greenhouse gas emissions by reducing the demand for energy, developing greener energy supplies, and supporting more sustainable lifestyles. The UK was one of the first countries to declare a climate emergency in May this year, followed by cities such as New York and Sydney. So what role can cities play in the fight against climate change?
Well, let's introduce today's panel for you. On the line from Germany is David Simon, Director of the Research Centre Mistra Urban Futures. We've also got Mattheos Santamouris, Professor of Architectural Studies at the University of New South Wales in Australia. With me here in the studio is Alyssa Gilbert, Director of Policy at the Grantham Institute, and Ryan Bellinson, a researcher in urban planning at the University of Sheffield. Welcome to all my guests today. So let's talk about why it's important to look at cities when we're combating climate change. Ryan?
Yeah, so cities are ground zero for climate change. While the international and even national level of politics is what typically gets a lot of the spotlight on climate change, cities are really where the rubber meets the road, that this is where the impacts of climate change are felt. It's also where the real impacts can be made. This is where carbon emissions are produced, so this is also where carbon emissions can be reduced, can be mitigated again. So cities are really the ground zero for where climate change takes place.
Okay, so how do we actually manage to cool our cities down then? We talk a lot about blue and green spaces. What does that mean?
Well, when you think about a city, what you might not notice is when it gets really hot, and that's something we're going to see more and more as climate change comes to bite, cities are actually a significant number of degrees warmer. It's called the urban heat island effect than the rural areas around it. The concrete and the way a city is designed makes it hotter and hotter. But if you do things like plant more trees, small parks, spaces with water in them, so these are called blue spaces and green spaces, green roofs on buildings, and integrated into the architecture, you can actually bring down that temperature. So you can keep it cooler, and in fact, you can also keep buildings warmer over the winter. So it helps buildings become more resilient to climate change and cities as a whole.
Mattheos, you work in high-performance architecture. So what about the buildings themselves? What kind of technologies can be used to make buildings more environmentally friendly?
Actually, we have the technology to decrease the energy consumption of buildings, and build almost zero energy consumption buildings. Also, we have the technology, and we have many zero energy consumption settlements. So buildings actually combined with, let's say, cities, may present a very low energy consumption and may decrease the anthropogenic heat generated by buildings, and also decrease the amplitude of the urban heat island intensity in cities.
David, what do you think about this idea of high-tech eco-cities? It does sound rather expensive.
Well, indeed, and this is one of the conundrums. There is a lot of talk about smart cities, everything connected by wireless grids, reducing the need for mobility, the circular economy and so on. But all the models that we have to date are designed around high income and elite conception of smart cities. And part of the challenge of sustainability, if we think globally, is to upscale and to understand that for the vast majority of urban residents, and particularly those who are now or will over the next 20 or 30 years urbanize in low and lower middle income countries, which is where the real crunch points are being encountered already, those kinds of solutions are unattainable. So the real challenge is going to be to find ways of doing all the things that we're talking about, but in an affordable and appropriate way for local communities and in tune with local resources and opportunities.
Do you guys agree with that? And who should be driving this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as David mentioned, more and more of the global population is urbanizing. Right now, about 50% of the global population is urban. By 2050, it's expected to be over 70%. And much of that, as David mentioned, is coming from developing countries. So we need to think about solutions for developing countries, also developed countries that utilize technologies that are out there already. Smart cities, negative emissions technologies is something that's popular right now in the discourse. These are things that will enable us in developed cities, Western cities, to live the sorts of lives we do now. But what we need to think about is the technologies that exist currently. How can we implement those to combat climate change? That's going to require us in cities, particularly in the West, to change our behavior. And that's why I believe smart cities...
A different way of thinking rather than just...
and behaving also. So smart cities can be a way of trying to avoid that behavior change. Things like flying less that are hard to implement.
But what about cities in deserts? We talk about developing countries. I mean, I lived in the Middle East for many years, and air conditioning is a massive thing because you're looking at people who live in environments which are 45, 50 degrees. I mean, is it possible to design a city where you don't need to use air conditioning, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other speakers also spoke about a low carbon building, and actually you can have low carbon that relates to heating and to cooling. So there's sort of passive design in buildings, which means building it orientated in a certain way, using certain building materials, so that effect that we get of a house becoming sort of unbearably hot doesn't happen so much, and then you need less cooling, and then once you need cooling, thinking about how you can do that renewably in a way that's low impact is quite possible.
I know you worked for the Deputy Mayor of London. How important is it to have someone like a mayor who drives this kind of change, or some obvious point of accountability?
Yeah, so it's really vitally important to have leadership in a city, and also connectivity at the city level to the citizens. I think this idea of doing something that's really locally relevant is really vitally important, something supported by citizens, and where you hear people's voices and it's contributed to is vital, whilst having someone at a mayor level or a deputy mayor level who's really driving it, and also looking at the city as a whole, so looking at things that relate to water, transport, energy, and social provision, culture. All of these things matter at a mayor level, and then saying, and how can I put climate into this? What are the things I can do about climate that deliver for all of those things for my citizens? So I think it's vital, that kind of leadership.
So there obviously needs to be a holistic approach to this. Mattheos,
Exactly.
and David, please jump in. How important is it that we look at a variety of factors when we're talking about sustainability?
I would say it's crucial, and you mentioned a moment ago, Shiulie, having lived in the Middle East. Well, one example to amplify the previous point about passive design is using local traditions where they're relevant. And in the Middle East and other parts of the Islamic world, traditional Islamic architecture was all about meeting local cultural and social norms, which of course are changing, but crucially also using natural ventilation to act, taking advantage of evening breezes, onshore breezes, facing prevailing winds and so on, facing away from rather than straight into the sun. And many other designs, open atria, water fountains in the center of courtyards and so on. feature shared with Roman architecture, for example. And these are some of the historical lessons that we can learn and adapt to today's world using modern as well as traditional materials and designs.
But David, do you think people want to do that? Because it is just so much more convenient to flick a switch and get AC cooling your apartment down. I mean, how do you persuade people that they have to look at these other ways of trying to, and possibly less efficient ways of trying to cool a building?
Well, I'm not sure it's either or. These can be incorporated into contemporary design and make them more affordable, use less per capita energy.
Mattheos, presumably it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Designs and ideas and technologies have to be adapted to whatever part of the world we're talking about.
Yeah, first we have to understand that, because of the regional climatic change in cities, combined with the global climatic change, and there are serious synergies between the two. For example, during a heat wave, the intensity of the urban heat island is increasing. This synergy creates serious problems on energy consumption of buildings, peak electricity demand, but mainly, the problem that we are facing and the problem of the future, it has to do with health issues, heat-related mortality and heat-related morbidity. Fortunately, we have enough data from developed countries and developed cities that really show us the association between energy and climatic change, peak electricity demand and climatic change, and also, the specific impact of overheating in health issues. And given that the problem of the future, will be in developing countries, really we have to develop appropriate technologies and appropriate policies to face the problem in situ.
And is that going to be the problem? Developing countries is where part of the problem lies, and they're going to have to be brought on board with all of this.
I mean, I think one of the things we haven't mentioned at all, we talk about heating a lot, is water. So a lot of the cities of the world, the major cities of the world, are on coastlines. And one of the other major impacts we're going to see of climate change is coastal flooding and sea level rise. And all of these things are happening in cities in the world that may or may not be wealthy or poor and are growing at a very, very rapid rate. So all of these countries around the world need to find ways to grow and manage and plan their cities with a view to these potential impacts, which include heating, but also include sea level rise, and that's really important. So we could even ask the question if we're helping to grow the right cities in those countries that are rapidly developing.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would also add we're talking about really big infrastructure projects to solve this issue. We're talking about changing the way buildings are created and built. We're changing the way cities, smart cities function. But people are at the heart of cities. When I think about climate change recently, the kind of disconnect that happens with people. In France recently, there's the Yellow Vest protests. That all started with a tax on petrol. In Oregon, where I'm from, there was a carbon cap and trade bill that was being proposed that citizens didn't understand why it was being proposed, so they had an armed revolt against the government there.
That's interesting. So the message isn't getting
through.
So
cities, because they're the ground zero of climate change, what we need to do is work with citizens. We as experts, if you will, shouldn't be dictating to citizens what the solutions are. We need to educate citizens about what climate change is, what the likely impacts will be, and use them to help us. Isn't that what we've been trying to do
for the last couple of decades?
I would argue we haven't done that.
There's been so much debate about climate change, and also is one of the problem that there is a lot of debate about climate change, and you have leaders like Donald Trump who downplay the effects, which must have an enormous impact.
Yeah, I mean, we have debates. You'll see in some media instances where they'll have one climate skeptic, one climate expert. We need more debates like this, where it's people that all understand what the science says and are talking about what we're going to do about it. That's a real debate that the public can engage with. We shouldn't be presenting the facts as being climate change may exist, it may not exist. That's not doing justice to science. We need to have a substantive...
Cut out all doubt, say this is the issue and this is what needs to be done.
Well, you wouldn't have a debate about gravity. You wouldn't say, does gravity exist, does it not? The same thing is true with climate science. Climate science is very unequivocal in what it's saying. So we need to be educating the public about what that science is.
That's really about what the solutions are. So I think what you're saying,
Absolutely.
which is really nice, is saying, okay, so now let's work with citizens. And cities are great for this because there are loads of citizens of all ages, and there are new citizens and long-standing citizens and really engaged and less engaged, wealthy and poor in all cities. So in the developing world, there are also wealthy and poor citizens. So a city is a great place to bring people together and talk about solutions and sometimes discuss things that are pretty dull most of the time. So some of this stuff, you know, that we're talking about, infrastructure, roads, energy, transport, are things that people don't usually care about. What they care about is, like you said, is it easy? Can I come in and can I go to work seamlessly?
And it has to be said money, because some of the initiatives, for example, introducing congestion charges, which we saw in London, highly unpopular when that first came in. I think everyone sort of accepted that. Now, committing to zero waste, which requires effort on the part of citizens. Low carbon buildings, that requires commitment from local governments. So all of these things together need a concerted effort, right?
Yeah. And when you talk about the congestion charge, if something like that is imposed by a mayor, it's great to have local leadership, but if that is just imposed by a mayor and citizens don't understand why is there a congestion charge now, that's when you get the negative aspects of climate change, protesting against those actions like the Yellow Vest protests. If we educate citizens about what the climate science is and what the potential solutions are that are out there now, engage them in the conversation, that's how we can have these big policy ideas around infrastructure that we're talking about actually manifest. When we have citizens helping us co-produce what the solutions are, that they're a part of the solution, not just being dictated to.
I think what's quite encouraging, and I was going to bring you in here, David, is that many cities now actually do have quite aggressive climate change goals. London, Boston, Sydney, Paris, all working to cut pollution and use renewable energy. And Reykjavik saying it's already running 100% on renewables. So how encouraging is it that there is this network of cities all working to become more eco-friendly?
Well, it's very encouraging, and I think these networks of cities like the C40, the 100 Resilient Cities, as well as global membership networks of municipalities around the world, are proving crucial to many of these initiatives precisely because of the way that they act as information exchange and networking fora, so that the mayors, the planners, everybody else talk to one another at their meetings, and they are actually sharing, exchanging ideas, and crucially beginning to work out how to make ideas that work elsewhere more appropriate by adapting them to local circumstances. And you mentioned the Reykjavik example. When President Trump announced that he was taking the US out of the Paris Accord on the climate agreement, for example, New York, now followed by Helsinki and others, have announced that they as cities will more than meet the targets that were set, and they're going to submit city reports to the review process. The problem is that the UN, as a club of national governments, doesn't yet have a mechanism to address regional local governments, which is one of the ironic challenges here, as Ryan alluded to. Cities, right at the beginning, are at the forefront of this, and yet they don't officially have membership status of the UN, although the various new climate and sustainable development accords all recognize the importance of cities and other regional governments to meeting this. But exchanging information, working together, and again, co-producing solutions, bringing on board even low-income, especially low-income and marginalized communities, who after all are the people at the forefront. They experience these unsustainable temperatures. They understand what it means not to have running water in a tap and have to use water sachets or go significant distances to fill jerry cans or whatever it might be, and how to adapt their lives to uncertainty and irregular supply. These are the voices that need to be at the table as much as the mayor and the city engineer and the town planner and the other so-called expert, to work it out together and make it more legible, more understandable, and so that those people's stake in the urban areas are recognized. And then we might have a chance of promoting greater urban sustainability wherever it might be.
Mattheos, do you think there are enough resources or enough of an incentive to invest in smart architecture, in making cities less overheated?
Yeah, it is very important to understand that in order to face the climatic change challenge by 2050, the total budget that we have really to invest is close to 100 trillion American dollars. So in reality, this is not just a problem. This is not just a challenge. It is an opportunity. And in case that we can really translate this problem into an opportunity, we'll have really the fantastic results regarding growth, creation of new jobs, and many other benefits for the economy. So in reality, climatic change has to be seen as an opportunity now and not just as a problem. And those countries that they invest in research in order to develop advanced mitigation and adaptation techniques and policies will have huge benefits in the future. While all those that they neglect the problem, I'm afraid that in the near future will be the clients of the rest, let's say, of the nations.
I know that some countries like the UK and Australia have declared a climate emergency. What does that mean? Does that help?
Absolutely, it helps. So a climate emergency declaration in and of itself is largely just a symbolic action. It doesn't lead to any direct changes, but what it does do is create space for leaders to step into, to talk about what climate change is, educate the public about what the issues really are. But also you asked before about, do we have enough money to invest in this? I would argue we have to. It's not a question of do we have enough money. That's what the Extinction Rebellion protests are about. That's what the youth climate strikes are about. It's not a question of do we have enough money, do we not have enough money. It's a question of our survival as a human race. So this climate emergency gets at that heart of the issue of this is an emergency, we need to do something about it. It creates space for leaders to move into. It creates space for activists to push leaders. And it's the first step in building a broader movement, a bigger movement towards the future we're all talking about. It's the thing that gets the ball rolling.
I think it's also particularly a nice thing to talk about in the context of cities and even smaller sized local authorities, because what you see is that you get declarations of climate emergencies, like you said, at a parliamentary or national level, but we're also seeing that happen more and more at a more local level. And
But are political leaders reacting fast enough, whether they're local leaders or national leaders?
well, in a sort of anecdotal sense, we've been contacted by people, we've been speaking to people who are local councillors in the UK, and we've been speaking to them about a new toolkit that we have about how at a local level you can bring together the multiple benefits of taking action on climate. And they've been saying, my local council just declared a climate emergency. I need to and want to do something about this. What do I do? So that's anecdotal, but that means that this kind of statement for people who are responsible politicians and understand that it comes from their electorate now want to do something about it. Whether that's quick enough or not remains to be seen, but at least this language of emergency starts to give people a sense of the actual urgency.
Okay, gentlemen on Skype, David and Mattheos.
Yes.
David, do you think we're moving fast enough? Because, of course, you know, heat waves are being predicted of being ever more frequent.
Well, we're not moving fast enough, but it's also true that extreme events or disasters are the best teachers. People are very reluctant to spend these large sums of money unless they understand in a very visceral sense what it means. And it's no accident that a city like New York, having been inundated twice in quick succession, first by the storm surges after Hurricane Katrina further south, but then most directly by Hurricane Sandy, have taken this on board and are completely redesigning their building and other construction standards to make them more resilient, to avoid the level of damage simply being a more frequent repeated event. And that's the sort of symbolic value of an emergency, whether you declare a climate emergency or whether you're responding to an immediate one. not just building back, so to speak, but building back better, as resilient scientists like to encourage us to do, but also more sustainably and in that joined up way that you alluded to earlier, Shiulie, because there is work done now that shows that when you integrate these new norms into construction, into the drainage capacity of stormwater drains, building appropriate levées and so on, it actually reduces the cost by something like 30 to 40% compared to the patchwork or the ad hoc responses to these emergencies. And as I think I said earlier, building these ideas into changing the design standards to cope with the changing conditions, anticipating rather than just reacting, is a crucial part of it. And if declaring emergency is part of that political flag waving, if you like, or slogan construction that enables these things to happen more rapidly and in a more coherent way, yes, I'm very much in favour.
David, thank you very much, and thank you to all my guests. I think we're all agreed that we need to be much more sustainable when it comes to our urban futures. Thank you for watching. Remember, you can see more discussions and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for TRT World Roundtable. For now, from me and all the team here, bye-bye.